two presenters, Polina Timina and Anisha Anantpurkar, that we already met her before. And the title of their presentation is Touring Russia, a New Turn in Kathak. Polina is a researcher and dancer who grew up in Russia, part of a choreographic ensemble specializing in competitive performances, contemporary dance, and Russian folkloric productions. She's graduated at Durham University's anthropology program, and she has reached embodied practices connected to community, well-being, and kinship. She completed her thesis on embodied responses to violence as part of her master's in Dance Anthropology, and he's interested in embodiment at the quotidian level, political performance, affect theory, and phenomenology. And Anisha is a dancer and researcher for Bangalore, India, and she's trained in Kathak and has mostly performed in India. Anisha has worked in dramaturgy, research, curation, and performance making, and she's currently an MA student of Dance Anthropology and ethnochoreology, and her dissertation looks at the processes of queering Hungarian folk dance practices in Budapest. So thank you, and I give you the word.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen, but I think my computer is not allowing me to. So Polina, in case yours works faster. Well, okay, so while we figure this out, mostly because our presentation is not entirely essential, I will try and start by introducing the topic. So our topic was born out of our collaboration as students first and traveling basically to 4 different European countries through Erasmus Mundus. And because of this collaboration, we were able to talk about the different cultural connections that we were able to think of when talking about our context. So this is how Touring USSR, a New Turn in Kathak was born. It is a small part of a larger project that we're thinking about. So I'm going to start by talking about these cultural connections that we noticed as we were just hanging out and watching movies, which is basically how this project started. I recounted once that there is a radio show that I grew up with that I would listen to in the car on the way back to school, which was called With Love from Russia. And Polina, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So while I was reflecting on that, I realized that there were huge chunks of that radio show that I didn't exactly remember the material of, but I really remembered them being in my space, in my surroundings, playing on the radio, whether I'm at home, listening to the radio at like 12 a.m. or just riding back from school. And what was super cool about that was that I also remembered that it was not necessarily about anything in particular. Sometimes I was really just listening to very niche facts about Russia, and other times it was about poetry in Russia. Sometimes it was about a new exhibition that opened in Russia. And while speaking to Polina, I had this question for the first time. Wait, why was I listening to this? And then why did it discontinue? To the point that we really couldn't find any archives online. So we tried to delve into this further, and I spoke to friends who said, oh, you know, being older than you, I remember that we read translated Russian literature. And I then recounted in my own dance education the presence of Russian tours or Russian ballet, which were just small snippets inserted into workshops, or sometimes a small class on holding your body or warming up. And this larger narrative that I kept thinking about, in addition to the sort of political landscape that we had studied and read about, which is that India is a country that believes in non-alliance, which came out of the Cold War. The Russian support for the war that was happening between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and so on and so forth. So as we tried to research this further, we realized that these cultural influences are spoken about very little in comparison to the economic connection between India and Russia, or the political connection between India and Russia. And the more we researched, the more we realized that the turn of the century during independence, during independence in 1947, there was a strong alliance between the USSR and India. And moving on from there, India in 1989 opened up its markets, and suddenly the US influence came into India, making the Russian influence seem less visible to people like me who grew up in a slightly different generation. And so this research is trying to pull on this thread of what happens with classical dance in 1947 and on, when a lot of these dances are being revived. And how do we think about these Russian tours and Russian ballet and the introduction of the proscenium stage in thinking about Kathak as a dance form as we see it today? Okay, Polina, next slide. So I think a lot of people might know already what Kathak is, but I'll just give a brief introduction that it is considered to be one of the 8 classical dances of India. And it is, again, given this title after independence, and there was a large nationalization process that happened at the time, where a lot of dances were not only considered national culture, but also were revived, because there was an Anti-Nautch Act that was imposed during the British colonial period, which essentially led to the decline of certain dances, or sometimes a complete non-existence of those dances. It is important to know, though, that Kathak as we see it today, or what we call Kathak, is in some senses a modern phenomenon, as in we don't know what Kathak looked like, or if it was even called Kathak in this sense before 1947. And this I bring up because this is the history that is traced by Margaret Walker, by Pallavi Chakravarti, which combines oral histories with some historical facts, where me growing up learning Kathak, I believed that it was the dance of the storytellers known as Kathakars or Kathaks, and that there are traceable lineages called gharanas to whom this dance belongs. And this, in a sense, is an appropriation of the form, because there are other performers like the wives who this dance has been appropriated from. And also what we see as Kathak today is very much something that this gharana system, or these dancers, these Brahmin men, have in some senses made. And this aesthetic can be in a lot of ways attributed to them. What is interesting about this is that we get to look at the creation of Kathak, if we were to think about Kathak as something that was in the making during this period. And these tours, especially to Russia or to France, or sometimes even to Indonesia, were a huge part of that process, because this is the first time when Kathak was being made for the stage. And the reason why Russia is so important is because of dancers like Uday Shankar or Ram Gopal, who were not necessarily Kathak dancers as we see Kathak today, but modern Indian dancers who played a large role in creating staged performances. And I will also talk about 2 prominent figures, such as Maya Rao and Kumudini Lakhya, who start talking about choreography and making dance for stage. Okay, next slide. So Kumudini Lakhya is a dancer who was in Ram Gopal's troupe, but later on came and decided, oh, I'm going to do one dance form. I'm not going to learn all of these various dance forms that Ram Gopal uses in his performances, but I'm going to do one dance form, and I choose to do Kathak because it is closer to my culture, it's closer to my language, etc. And she toured to Russia. At the same time, and around the same time, Maya Rao, another dancer, went to Russia on a scholarship, learned Russian for 3 years, and choreographed Shakuntala for Russian ballerinas, and also learned a little bit of ballet during this exchange. She comes back from the USSR and establishes a school after a couple of years in Bangalore called the Natya Institute of Kathak and Choreography. Kumudini Lakya, another contemporary, and both of them learned from many people, but also sometimes from the same people, most of them male gurus. So they become one of the first female dancers to be dancing Kathak. And when I say this, I don't talk about the Tavayevs and some other female dancers who we don't know much about. So these are the first female dancers to learn from these gurus as we know them today. She establishes a school called Kadamb after she returns from the UK from dancing in Ram Gopal's troupe, and actually is one of the first people to go to Russia to stage a production during a cultural exchange, which happens in Tashkent, which is now in Uzbekistan, but also she tours through Siberia and sometimes Mongolia, depending on what that tour demanded from her, and finally arrives in Moscow to also perform there. What we learned from Maya Rao, for instance, is that this entire Natya Institute of Kathak and Choreography is heavily influenced by her ideas of choreography that she learned in Russia or in the USSR, specifically in Moscow, because that's where she was based. And as you can see in this picture, there's these Russian dancers wearing the sari, and her choreography of Shakuntala is one of the first known choreographies done by her. The very notion of choreography until this point didn't really exist because all of these dances were solo dances and oftentimes temple dances, if not court dances, which meant that the structure of these dances was completely different. And now we see with large proscenium stages and the existence of these dances on these large proscenium stages, these dancers are taking inspiration from many Western forms, ballet being one of them. And we also know this because of Anna Pavlova's interactions with Uday Shankar and Ram Gopal. So what is interesting is that these female dancers are never actually spoken about when we think about the existence of Kathak choreography today, or even why we call something that tells a story on stage with multiple dancers and recorded music in a scene-wise fashion as a Kathak ballet, for instance. So with that in mind, we started doing oral history interviews of the students of Kumiben, and these oral history interviews are in some ways the first kind of evidences that we're able to gather on what happened at that time, what was this creation process like, what was Kathak like before they entered this troupe, and what happened to Kathak after. And I think looking at this Russian balletic influence is so important because we tend to ignore the fact that Kathak was always in the making at that time, and we just think of this revival in itself as this form of decolonization that, oh, we have now brought back what was once suppressed. But there are many internal forms of, there are many power structures within this of religion, gender, and caste. And these kind of come to the fore, especially when we're thinking about also who then was allowed to go abroad, how do we see staged choreography, who did they learn from, most importantly. So the first thing is the very existence of the proscenium stage becomes popular during this time. And also the scale of the proscenium change really changes the dance. And the person we interviewed spoke a lot about not just the concept of choreography, what choreography means to them, which is different from group dance, which is like what existed until then, until Kumiben, was that 20 people would stand on stage and do the same thing in order to occupy the large space that a proscenium stage took. And choreography to them meant that you're not just using this space with multiple people doing the same thing, but rather telling a story through movement in itself, and maybe not, maybe using Kathak a little more creatively as opposed to just showing technique. It also meant that multiple people played multiple different roles in telling of a story. Usually in Kathak, one actor is able to play one character, take a spin, and play the other character. And this development also happened as choreography became more popular. And lastly, the extension of the body, which is that movements would often not be extended all the way up and could be danced right here small, because it was danced in a smaller space and you didn't need an audience that's sitting that far away to be able to see you. And you didn't need to dance for as many people as a proscenium stage demands you to. So the existence or the implementation of extension of the body within especially Kumi Ben's troupe, but now we see it in a lot of dancers, started coming up as people danced on the proscenium stage, which was most common when they did these foreign tours. Next slide. Yeah. Polina, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so thank you for that wonderful introduction. Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. So yeah, Anisha took you through the process of how we arrived at this research, how we've been carrying it out. And the oral histories really approach has been very important in that a lot of these dancers who toured at the time and went to the USSR and Russia are alive. And so being able to speak to them and understand their perspective on what happened and what was the importance of these exchanges has really directed our thought. As we said, we're kind of right in the beginning of this project still. So Anisha presented a few of our kind of preliminary findings, and that's about the proscenium form and how much everything developed around that in terms of costumes and set design, the choreography, and the extension of the body and the use of time space. And I just wanted to contextualize this a little bit in some of the literature that we see, particularly on dances that emerged in imperial and colonial times. So, and first we have a quote from Stanger that fantasies of the material spaces can become enacted in dances. And Arabelle Stanger is looking at actually Russian ballet in this case and talking about how you put on a stage a vision that you have of prosperity. So it's a narration of a world that you make not just visible or material, but fully embodied by dancers. And so we are looking to extend that into how we understand choreography in Kathak as well. Because how does a vision of a nation change when you reform the dance, and how does multiple dancers on a big stage with each their own role stand as a metaphor for multicultural nations that are attempting to unify and come together in specific aesthetic visions. And another point here is from the work of Anthony Shea, who looked at how ensemble functioned in the USSR, because this creation of the folkloristic ensemble that came to represent ethnic identity of the many republics of the USSR was a very top-down sort of project. It was state instituted, it was regulated. And at the same time that the state was really wiping out local ways of being and local culture, it was pushing them to these performative kind of identities. And so there is a lot of participation in these republic folkloric ensembles, because that is the way to kind of participate in your heritage. But this is the process, this is what the process looked like in the USSR. And though we see some of the influences very clearly in how institutionally some of the approaches were transplanted, including by Maya Rao's school, it's a very different kind of attitude towards what is being done, because it is actually being reappropriated by these dancers and used to build their own understanding of what you would like the form to be, and moving away from the gharanas and from the lineages into something that is more democratic, but it still has an air of dispossession, we'll say, because it's still pushing people out of the dance, especially courtesans who were in the nearest history associated with it. So as we kind of move forward, we're attempting to look at these different layers and understand who are the heirs and the users of a dance, to take a concept by Egil Backa. So there are people who you can say have inherited dance and people who learn it. And I think that this research has actually destabilized our ideas of who are the heirs and the users, because a lot of the people that became successful dancers like Kumudini Lakia would be considered users of the dance because they did not belong to a lineage. And so understanding how are different claims made and how do certain narratives gain traction and why they become the dominant narrative has been one of our initial preoccupations. And as we keep moving forward and discovering more, it's really becoming wider and wider. So, but we do hope to, I'm sorry about that. We do hope to make this into a performance as well. We would like to have an artistic aspect to it. And so we're kind of reflecting on, well, how do you learn a lot of things, particularly about decolonization or reappropriation, and do something about it with your own body, in a sense. And we would like to welcome conversation on this topic. If anyone in the audience has ideas or suggestions. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. It has been a pleasure to present for you.
Thank you both for the wonderful presentation. It's very interesting, and I invite our participant to ask questions and to join the conversation.
Well, people are thinking, I'd love to add another point, which is that I think in the previous talk, Dr. Shweta really spoke about the institutionalization of classical dances and the importance of that in the revival of these classical dances. And with Kathak, what's really interesting is that you see that these tours actually directly influence the ways in which dance is institutionalized, as you see in Maya Rao's Institute, which is completely influenced by her time in Russia. And I think that these international tours, especially especially in the USSR, because they actually continue today, have played a much larger role, which we can only understand through oral history interviews, because at one point people just stopped writing history, especially with the larger gurus of Birju Maharaj and basically the men who took over the art form after independence. And I think it is super important and interesting to see how these influences of ballet really helped these two women specifically, but also perhaps other dancers, cope with the new ways in which dance needed to be performed in order not to just sustain yourself and make money, but also in this new market where dance is not being funded by kings or by a court or by a temple, but rather by audiences. And I think these international tours are actually one of the main ways to see how this dance then was also a way to provide a new kind of experience to these audiences if it's not being done in a temple anymore or in a court. And yeah, I don't think enough scholarship really exists on this interaction and how this also enabled these women to develop institutes, to develop productions, to sustain themselves as dancers. And of course, what that means in terms of what influences then come into Kathak, and how do we think about decolonization when you already have a problem of internal caste-based appropriation, the women being pushed out, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And I think especially to the dynamics that we have described, there is a tradition of talking about cultural diplomacy as soft diplomacy. And I think that probably in certain situations, this is, it acts as a kind of soft power, but we're really seeing, and we're still in early stages, so we're cautious about making big statements, but we're seeing a lot of influence in how things took shape because of this exchange. So we're interested in developing ideas of also how countries interact with each other, and it is on very individual levels. But this is also what this project is about. How do the little things and the mundane and the dances, the culture, all contribute to relationships and attitudes that we may view as essentialist.
Yeah, and then to think about today and think about India's stance today, especially with the war in Ukraine and their neutral stance, about how, this connection, this cultural connection has really been going on since independence, where dancers are performing in small villages in Siberia even. So to think about how this, what we deem as soft diplomacy or soft power, can actually carry on in such tangible ways. Sorry, I feel like I saw a hand. I'm not sure.
Make yourself known.
I cannot see if someone have her hand up, so just jump in and ask your question if someone have one. Well, I just want to make a comment, and is the fact that sometimes, like, I think is very, very interesting this relationship, and sometimes this Eurocentric vision to think the relationship just with Europe, like erase other kind of relationship that can happen, like, and so what is more visible is, or what is object of research is the relationship with Europe or this. So I think that your research really open another way of thinking and to think not in contrast to, but like building other kind of relationality.
Yeah, for sure, because I mean, there's a lot written about Uday Shankar and Ram Gopal, especially because they spent a lot of time in Europe, and because, or even Madame Menaka, there's a whole archive in Germany about her dances, especially because there was so much interest in the Oriental or Orientalism at the time. So these dances also like really connected with ideas of what was interesting to Europeans at the time regarding spirituality or Hinduism. And actually a lot of the stories probably took shape because of this interest. And then I think Pallavi Chakravarti or Margaret Walker, one or both, write about how when Anna Pavlova actually comes to India and starts looking for these dances, she doesn't find any. In fact, she goes to Calcutta and she sees one of the traditional temple dances and she's like, oh, but that's not dance. Like, that's not what I'm looking for. But then she sees Uday Shankar and she sees Ram Gopal and she's like, no, but that's what I'm looking for. So there's also a little bit of that, where there is a lot of archive about what Europeans did find interesting, and especially during that period where there was exchange, especially during the Orientalist interest period in the 1930s. And I think this is interesting because it comes after independence. It comes when India doesn't have those kind of relationships with Europe, and it comes in a way where Russian dancers also come to India, and we're trying to find archives on those. So this cultural exchange has a lot to do with the kind of political ideas of both countries and what kind of relationships they wanted to build. obviously the presidents and prime ministers and other dignitaries were present at a lot of these performances as well.
Yeah, and I would just add that even though we are focusing on our own countries, we'll say, but that this Oriental gaze is, I think that's been one of the challenging things, in that it's kind of elusive at times, but especially when we go back to the literature, we knock back into it. And even if you look at tradition of ballet, it's also very particular and also taken from Europe. So there are all these different layers, and as Anisha has mentioned, there's caste, there's gender, there are different political kinds of organizations, because we are dealing with socialist visions versus capitalist kind of ideas, because the Cold War is happening during that time too, and even it's something that we have to be mindful of in research, because those big power dynamics were did shape the smaller ones as well. So the different threads that you have to kind of keep in mind, especially when you're researching relations between what may be deemed two peripheries in a way, which in the case of the Russia, that might be a little bit of a big statement, but just that there is us not focusing on Europe is very intentional, but that does not mean that Europe isn't present, basically. Yeah, and we do have a hand, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, the time it's finished, but given that there is the break now, we prefer to take the break, and we will return at 3:55. And if Andrea wants to do the question, if you're happy to answer the question, even there is the break, and we'll prefer to stay here, can stay here and listen to the answer. So Andrea, you can ask your question.
Hello, it's been great listening to all of the speakers so far, and I was just it was just a remark also that influence really is noticeable also in South America, Central America, and of course in the Caribbean, in Cuba, how the USSR at the time of the Cold War has influenced our dancing and the institution of ballet in these countries. So it's really wide opening, and I would be looking forward to contact you later and talking a little bit about it. I was just wanted to ask about your last reference of Baca about hairs and users. Do you have like a paper that I can refer to that? Just that's
Yeah, we'd be happy to send that to you.
Oh yeah, and please join us in interpreting it, because we find that when we try and apply it to these contexts, first of all, it gives you an English word in some senses for what like heirs is not a word we would necessarily use in Kathak. Like we say Gharana, we say the people from the Gharana, or like something like that. But it's a very interesting framework, which also we poke holes at, because obviously it doesn't fit, it doesn't necessarily make sense, and most importantly, it also opens new ways of thinking about dance ownership, I suppose. So we'll send, if you share your email, we could also send it to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the USSR had its hands in a lot of various bowls. So, and this partnership with Anisha has been very interesting in having both of those perspectives, but we would also be really interested in how it worked in other places, because obviously it was very specific to each place, because it's not on, it's not a one-way road, as we've just demonstrated with some of our initial findings. It's very much something that can be used as a tool, which is interesting, and I think a very important way to talk about decolonization, because people have agency and they can make choices.
Yeah, and if there's time in the break, I've got like questions in the chat that I could answer. If not, I'll answer them via text. Or maybe just one out of the three that we have.
I think that it depends. Sorry?
I was just going to say, there's still about 4 minutes left in the break. So if you don't mind answering questions, go for it.
Okay, yeah, great. And so the first one is by Hadia. I hope I pronounced your name right. And they're saying, maybe you mentioned, but their question is, what is your stand on the colonization in the context of Kathak when whole of Kathak has lots of gender and class segregation embedded? Yeah, I mean, my stance is that I didn't talk much about it. And one example is, the complete erasure of not just the entire community of the wives, but also their repertoire. I think Pallavi Chakraborty and Margaret Walker, who are like basically the two people who have written quite extensively on this, talk about it quite well with a lot of archival resources. I think it's a huge concern. I think it's something that we in the dance community don't talk about enough. And I think there are some performances coming out these days where we do talk about courtesans, where we do talk about the wives, but there are many other dancers who have been erased from this tradition. And this tradition has been like basically been called the tradition of the people from these gharanas. Even if you look at their websites, they're like tracing 7 generations back. Let's talk about Kathak through the ages. And if you investigate, you really know that Kathak in the way we see it today really did not exist. So I would recommend those 2 books. If other people have other recommendations, I would love to read those as well. And also it's probably helpful for others. But apart from like really positioning myself and saying this is how I feel about those things, I don't think we have taken the time to go into that because our research starts a little later. And we already have to deal with certain oral histories, which like really have not been collected, and just we have other gaps to fill. So I do think some literature exists on this. We just don't talk about it enough. Yeah. Oh, okay. Awesome. Yes, would love to keep in touch. Thank you so much. And have you seen some appropriation of the Kathak movement in the Russian ballets, or it is at least considered in some moment of the history? Okay. Jatsiv, I have not looked that far. Honestly, I've not looked at enough Russian ballets. However, there were times like, what is it called? Bayader, right, Polina?
Yeah, so and this again is where some of the Oriental gaze comes in. There is a ballet called Le Bayader, which is fashioned in the French language, but I do believe it's a Russian ballet, and it is about a Hindu story. So, and I mean, the problem with ballet is that it's so elitist and exclusive that it doesn't deem itself influenced by many things. So so we're still kind of working on figuring out how to see some of those things. What we have been started working with is looking at, well, who is it that these dancers who came from India to the USSR worked with, and they often worked with other folkloristic ensembles to create dances together. And we have particularly been looking at the case of one from Uzbekistan, and seeing how that exchange was happening and how movements were shared there and approaches. And it's quite interesting because it's all very politically fraught. Obviously, dancers are kind of shuttled between places. There aren't any translators. They don't really want people talking to each other. So we're still working on the ballet part, but actually the part that for now has been most interesting has been about, well, how did these interactions actually happen when people went and toured? Because they consistently did both ways.